The Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, Barbara Creecy, is participating in a panel discussion on coal transition at COP28 in Dubai. Decommissioning power stations will see job losses affecting communities in surrounding areas. President Cyril Ramaphosa says government is addressing the challenges facing communities around the decommissioned Komati power station in Mpumalanga, for example. Dr. Alex Lenferna joins us now. He is the General Secretary of the Climate Justice Coalition. Dr. Lenferna, good evening. Welcome to the program. Very interested tonight on your thoughts and what's been heard so far, especially on our Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan. This is the JET IP that was presented by the President to the summit.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think it's a very interesting proposal that has been put forward, and it's a massive 300-page document, so there's lots of different details that we could get into. But I think there's some big questions we should be asking about this implementation plan. And one is, how fast is it going to go? Because there's been a lot of noise from the ANC about slowing down the decommissioning of coal plants. And there's a big question about whether that will actually be in line with South Africa's fair share of climate action. And there's also big questions about, how the finance will flow.
Alex, we've lost your audio there. I'm not sure what's gone wrong, but let's try and, I don't know, if you mute and unmute, perhaps that might work. Let's give it another go as you pick up your answer there. All right, we're talking there to Dr. Alex Lenferna about South Africa's presentations at COP28. Just want to make sure, can you hear me or not?
I can hear you. I think the audio.
All right, there we go. We've got your audio back. Please continue, Alex.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of questions. The plan is massive, and there's a lot of big questions we need to be asking. And particularly as we are in the grips of this load shedding crisis, the government has failed time and time again to invest in renewable energy at the speed and scale that's required to really address this. And so it's one thing to have an implementation plan, it's another to implement it. And I think this is where we often fall very short in terms of our governance.
Well, let's go to, you touched on, we touched on something important in the introduction there. The president of COP28, Sultan Al-Jaber, raised temperatures on his own, saying that there was no science linking a phase out of fossil fuels to restricting global heating, which he then said were misinterpreted, and then emphasized his commitment to climate science. But given his position and calls for a phase down rather than a phasing out of climate dependency, where does South Africa sit in that? And where do we have the certainty that might answer some of the questions that you've been raising around when are we slowing down or speeding up?
Yeah, I think the first thing to point out is it's very clear the science says we must be phasing out coal, oil and gas, and we need to do so rapidly. And we have the solutions needed to do that, which are renewables, which are storage, which are multifold. We were talking about electric vehicles earlier in the segment. We have the solutions available. Now, the challenge with someone like the Sultan Al-Jaber is he's the head of a national oil company, one of the biggest in the world. And so there's obviously a conflict of interest there. They are planning to increase oil production contrary to what the science says. And so even though he might retreat from his statement, the actual plans of his country are out of line with what we need to do. And unfortunately, South Africa, even under its JET IP, if you look at the pledges that it made, it's not in line with what was agreed to under the Paris Climate Agreement, which was to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're not doing our fair share. And that had to do with the fact that our ruling party is also very wedded to oil, coal, and gas interests. The ANC, through its Tebe Trust, has invested in Shell. Through Chancellor House, has invested in Seriti, a coal company. And so the ANC is also conflicted in terms of its interests, and because of that is slowing down the transition, even though their own government's modeling shows us that a predominantly renewable energy future delivered much faster would not only help us tackle the climate crisis, but would be the best solution to our load shedding crisis and would help us reduce energy costs. And so I think what the UN Climate Summit showed was the importance of these conflicts of interest and how our governments are captured by the polluting interests that we need to be pushing back against.
Well, this is obviously one of the issues that has brought you into conflict in between the NGOs and government and the energy minister specifically. But let's come back, Alex, to how all of this affects communities. While there might be that conflict between party and government position on what we do with the reliance on fossil fuels, whether we stick with our petroleum dependency or phase out, countries including the US and UK brought the value of our Just Energy Transition Partnership to about $95 billion. How effective are those commitments made to affected communities? And more importantly, you know, where is the benefit to communities who ultimately, like young people and women in particular, are the biggest, victims, I should say, of climate change?
Yeah, I think that's such a vitally important question, because it's one thing to have these big pledges at the international level that talk about channeling climate finance to communities. But I mean, there was a report coming out the other day about, Mpumalanga is the most coal-dependent province by far. And the challenge is that a lot of Mpumalanga municipalities are in such a state of disrepute when it comes to how they manage their finances that they're not really capable, and they're not really fit to funnel the finances from the JETS IP, these implementation plans, into local communities. And so there are major, major challenges at the municipal governance level of taking these international finance commitments and delivering them at the local level. And I think there also hasn't yet been enough funding flowing to dedicate to issues like ensuring that coal workers and coal-dependent communities actually have meaningful economic alternatives available. And we've seen this at Komati, right? I think Komati was decommissioned in alignment with the ANC's plans, not with the JETS plans by the international partners. And because the ANC failed to put in place the necessary policies and the necessary structures to ensure that workers and communities weren't left behind, a lot of people were left behind, right?
Yeah. Again, these are vital because it talks to the lives and livelihoods of people in communities all across not only South Africa, but across the African continent. I would love to talk to you more specifically about whether you feel those voices, those stakeholder voices, are represented enough at that almost executive level at COP28, but perhaps we'll do that in another conversation. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Dr. Alex Lenferna, who is the General Secretary of the Climate Justice Coalition.